Hello everyone, I am the storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel also. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. Story 1. The Shadow in the Mirror. Ava had always been drawn to old houses, but when she found a listing for a Victorian-era mansion in a small town, something about it felt different. The house on Blackwood Street was tall and imposing, with intricate woodwork and a massive stained glass window above the entrance. It had been abandoned for decades, but Ava, a photographer with a fascination for urban decay, saw its potential. She arrived at dusk, the sky painted in shades of burnt orange and deep purple. As she pushed open the heavy oak doors, a rush of cold air greeted her. Dust covered the mahogany floors and cobwebs clung to the corners of the high ceiling. Yet there was an odd sense of presence in the air, something watching, waiting. Ava set down her bag and explored the house, her camera clicking with every step. The grand staircase led to a corridor lined with doors, each one leading to forgotten memories. At the end of the hallway, she found an antique mirror standing nearly 7 feet tall. Its gold frame was tarnished, but the glass was eerily pristine. She wiped off the dust with her sleeve and peered into the reflection. That was the first time she saw it. A shadow moved behind her in the mirror. But when she turned around, there was nothing there. That night, Ava decided to stay in the house. She set up her sleeping bag in the parlor, near the fireplace, where she could keep an eye on the mirror. Despite the cold, she felt an inexplicable pull toward it. At midnight, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like wind rustling through the trees, but soon she could make out words. "Ava, help me." She sat up, heart pounding. The voice was coming from the mirror. Slowly, she stood and approached it, the old wooden floor creaking beneath her feet. The reflection was off. Her movements were slightly delayed, the light dimmer, the shadows darker. And then she saw it again, the shadow. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It had form, tall and thin, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Ava took a step back, but the shadow in the mirror took a step forward. Her breath hitched. The shadow wasn't behind her. It was inside the mirror. Then, in the blink of an eye, it lunged. Ava screamed and fell backward, knocking over an old chair. The mirror shuddered, but the glass remained intact. The shadow was gone. For now. Determined to understand what was happening, Ava spent the next morning researching the house. She drove to the town library, where an old woman named Mrs. Whitmore recognized the address immediately. "Blackwood House," the librarian whispered, her face paling. "You shouldn't be there." Mrs. Whitmore told Ava the story of Eleanor Blackwood, a woman accused of witchcraft in the late 1800s. Rumors claimed she had a mirror that could trap souls. When the townspeople accused her of cursing a child, they stormed the house and shattered every mirror, except one. Eleanor was never seen again. Some say she still lingers in that mirror. Ava returned to the house, her mind buzzing. Was Eleanor Blackwood the shadow she had seen? As the sun set, she sat before the mirror, her camera ready. She whispered, "Eleanor, are you there?" Silence. Then the surface of the mirror rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. A woman appeared, her eyes hollow, her face gaunt. "Help me, please." Ava's heart ached. Eleanor wasn't the monster. She was the prisoner. "How can I help you?" Ava asked. But before Eleanor could answer, the shadow returned. Its long, bony fingers wrapped around Eleanor's throat, dragging her back into the darkness. Eleanor's mouth opened in a silent scream as the shadow turned its empty gaze toward Ava. And then it lunged, this time not just in the mirror. Ava stumbled backward as a freezing grip wrapped around her wrist. She tried to break free, but the shadow was pulling her in. The surface of the mirror became liquid, swallowing her fingers, her hand, her arm. She fought, screaming, but it was useless. Darkness consumed her. When Ava opened her eyes, she was standing inside the mirror. The parlor was still there, but it was wrong. The colors were muted, the air thick with decay, and Eleanor stood beside her. "You shouldn't have come," Eleanor whispered. "Now you're trapped like me." Ava turned, and her blood ran cold. On the other side of the mirror, where she had been moments ago, was the shadow. Number, not the shadow. Her. The reflection of Ava smiled, but it wasn't her smile. It was stretched too wide, the eyes too dark. The thing in the mirror had taken her place. Ava pounded on the glass, screaming for help, but no one could hear her. No one ever would. A week later, a man named Daniel purchased the house on Blackwood Street. He loved its Gothic charm and planned to restore it. As he explored his new home, he noticed a beautiful antique mirror. The frame was exquisite, though the glass seemed odd, too deep, too dark. Curious, he stepped closer, and inside the mirror, Ava watched him. She screamed, she begged, she pounded against the glass, but all Daniel saw was his own reflection, and behind him, a shadow moved. Story 2. The door that knocked itself. Lucas and Emily had always loved adventure. Newlyweds and eager to escape the city, they purchased a house in a quiet countryside village called Black Hollow. The price was suspiciously low, but the couple didn't care. The house was old, built in the early 1800s, and had a peculiar charm with its ivy-covered walls and grand wooden doors. The villagers, however, weren't as excited. When Lucas mentioned their new home to the local shopkeeper, the old man's expression darkened. "You bought that house," he muttered, shaking his head. Emily chuckled nervously. "Is there something wrong with it?" The old man hesitated. "Nothing you need to worry about. Just keep your doors locked at night." Lucas and Emily exchanged puzzled glances, but decided not to press further. The first night in the house was peaceful. The couple unpacked, made dinner, and curled up in front of the fireplace. By midnight, they went to bed, exhausted but happy. Then, at exactly 3:07 a.m., a loud knock echoed through the house. Knock, knock, knock. Lucas groaned and sat up. Who the hell would be knocking at this hour? Emily shivered. Maybe a lost traveller. Lucas grabbed a flashlight and trudged downstairs. When he reached the grand front door, he hesitated. The knocking had stopped. Slowly, he turned the knob and opened the door. Nothing. The empty countryside stretched before him under the moonlight. The dirt path leading to the house was undisturbed. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. Shrugging, he locked the door and went back to bed. The next night, the knocking returned. Knock, knock, knock. Again, exactly at 3:07 a.m. Emily sat up, heart pounding. "Lucas, don't open it." But he was already out of bed. This time, he rushed to the door and swung it open in one motion. Nothing. Frustrated, he stepped outside, scanning the yard with his flashlight. The wind howled through the trees, but the night was empty. When he turned to go back inside, he noticed something strange. The door, now closed, began to tremble. Then it knocked itself. 3 loud bangs, as if unseen fists were pounding from the inside. Lucas stumbled backward. cold sweat dripping down his back. He turned the knob frantically and shoved the door open. The hallway was empty, silent, shaken. He locked the door and hurried upstairs. "It's the wind," he muttered to himself. But deep down, he knew better. By the fourth night, Emily refused to sleep. They both sat in the living room, waiting. At 3:07 a.m., the knocking came again. Knock, knock, knock. Lucas grabbed a chair and propped it against the door handle. "Let's see you open now." The house fell silent. Then, from the other side of the door, a whisper slid through the keyhole. "Let me in," Emily screamed. Lucas grabbed her hand and bolted upstairs, slamming their bedroom door shut. They sat in silence, listening. The knocking had stopped, but something dragged itself across the floor below. The next morning, they drove straight to the village library. An elderly librarian, Mrs. Holloway, recognized the house immediately. "You should leave," she said simply. Lucas leaned forward. "Why?" Mrs. Holloway sighed and pulled out an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Family of 5 vanishes without a trace. Black Hollow mystery remains unsolved." She explained that in 1903, a man named Edward Albright lived in the house with his wife and 3 children. One morning, the family simply vanished. The front door was found wide open, but no footprints led away from it. The strangest part, neighbors reported hearing knocking at their own doors the night before the family disappeared. "They say the house keeps calling for new souls," Mrs. Holloway whispered. Determined to put an end to the nightmare, Lucas and Emily prepared for one last confrontation. Armed with salt, candles, and an old iron crowbar, they waited. At 3:07 a.m., the knocking returned. But this time, it wasn't just at the front door. It came from every door in the house. The bedroom door, the closet, the attic, the bathroom. Knock, knock, knock. Emily clutched Lucas's hand. "It wants us to open them." The air grew thick, suffocating. The knocking grew louder. Then, without warning, the bedroom door burst open. A black void stood beyond it, an empty abyss stretching into nothingness. And out of the darkness, a hand reached for them. Emily screamed. Lucas grabbed the crowbar and swung at the arm, but it passed right through. The hand clutched his wrist, freezing him to the bone. Shadows surged forward, wrapping around him. Emily grabbed him, screaming his name. She fought, pulling him away from the darkness. The knocking turned into a deafening pounding, shaking the walls. With one final pull, she yanked Lucas back, slamming the door shut. The house trembled violently. Then, silence. The knocking had stopped. The air was still. The door never knocked again. Lucas and Emily left the house the next morning, never looking back. They sold it at a loss and moved far away, vowing never to speak of Black Hollow again. Years later, a new family moved in. One peaceful night, at exactly 3:07 a.m., the father woke up to a sound. Knock, knock, knock. He walked downstairs, confused. He placed his hand on the doorknob, and the door knocked itself. Then, from the keyhole, a whisper, "Let me in." Story 3. The Girl Who Vanished at Dawn. The small town of Ravenswood was a place where nothing ever happened. A town of misty hills, winding roads, and dense forests that whispered secrets with the wind. But one morning, as the first light of dawn crept over the rooftops, something changed. Emily Carter, a 17-year-old girl with bright blue eyes and golden hair, was gone. She had left her home the previous night to visit a friend, but she never arrived. When the sun rose, there was no trace of her. Only her phone, lying in the middle of an empty street. The town panicked. The sheriff, Daniel Graves, led a search party, scouring the woods, questioning everyone. But it was as if Emily had vanished into thin air. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just silence. Then the whispers began. Ravenswood had an old legend, the tale of the Whispering Woods. The elders spoke of a girl who had gone missing there a century ago, just before sunrise. She was never found, but some claimed to hear her voice in the wind. The town dismissed it as superstition, a story meant to keep children from wandering into the woods alone. But Emily's best friend, Sarah, wasn't convinced. She remembered Emily mentioning something strange. A week before she disappeared, something about a dream. "I keep dreaming of a girl standing at the edge of the woods," Emily had said. "She looks like me, but her eyes, they're empty." Now, standing at that very spot, Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. The trees swayed, and for a moment, she thought she heard a voice, soft, almost pleading. "Help me." Sarah turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. The woods were empty, but the air felt heavier, charged with something unseen. Determined to find Emily, Sarah convinced her friends Mark and Jason to help her investigate. They retraced Emily's last known steps, following the road where her phone was found. The deeper they went, the more unnatural everything felt. The wind whispered their names. Shadows moved when they shouldn't. Then they found it. An old diary buried under a fallen tree, its pages damp and yellowed. The name on the cover, Eleanor Whitmore, the missing girl from a century ago. As Sarah flipped through the pages, her hands trembled. Eleanor had written about hearing voices, about a dream of a girl who looked like her. And then, on the final page, 4 words sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. "The girl is me." The ground beneath them trembled. A cold gust of wind blew through the trees, carrying the same whisper, "Help me." Sarah, Mark, and Jason ran, but the forest had changed. The path twisted, the trees stretched impossibly high. The air smelled different, old, like dust and decay. It was no longer Ravenswood. Then they saw her. Emily stood in a clearing, her back to them. But something was wrong. Her body was rigid, her skin pale as moonlight. And when she turned, her eyes were not her own. They were hollow, empty. "You shouldn't be here," she said, but her voice was layered, as if someone else was speaking through her. Sarah took a step forward. "Emily." "It's me, Sarah. We're taking you home." Emily shook her head. "I can't leave. She won't let me." "Who?" The wind howled, and from the darkness a figure emerged. A girl in a tattered white dress, her face obscured by long, matted hair. But when she lifted her head, Sarah's blood turned to ice. It was Emily, or at least something wearing her face. "She took my place," the real Emily whispered, "and now she wants another." The doppelganger lunged. Sarah barely had time to react before Mark pulled her back. Jason grabbed a fallen branch and swung at the creature, but it dissolved into mist, reforming behind them. "One must stay," the voice whispered. They realized the truth too late. The legend wasn't just a warning. It was a trap. The girl who vanished at dawn never truly disappeared. She was replaced. Sarah's mind raced. If Eleanor had been taken 100 years ago, and now Emily, there was only one way to break the cycle. "We have to bring her back," Sarah shouted. The 3 of them joined hands around Emily, chanting her name, calling her home. The air crackled, the doppelganger screamed, the forest blurred, and then everything went black. Sarah woke up on the forest floor. The sun was rising. Birds chirped. Emily lay beside her, breathing but unconscious. Mark and Jason groaned as they sat up. They were back in Ravenswood, The trees were normal again. The whispers were gone. Emily's eyes fluttered open. Sarah. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. You're safe. As they helped Emily to her feet, something in the distance caught Sarah's eye. A shadow. A figure standing at the edge of the woods. A girl in a white dress watching. But as the first rays of sunlight touched the trees, the figure faded, leaving only the whisper of the wind behind. For the first time in a century, the girl who vanished at dawn had finally been freed, or so they thought. Story 4. The silent screams in the basement. The old Langley house had stood on Hollow Street for over a century. It was a relic of the past, with its towering Victorian architecture and ivy-covered walls. Nobody had lived there for decades, and rumours swirled about why. Some said the last family that lived there simply disappeared overnight. Others claimed they still lived there, just not in a way anyone could see. When Mark and Lisa Bennett bought the house, they dismissed the stories as small-town superstition. The price was too good to pass up, and they were eager to move in with their 12-year-old daughter, Emily. But the moment they set foot inside, an unsettling feeling settled in Lisa's chest. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and the deep shadows in the corners of the rooms felt alive. Still, they unpacked, painted the walls, and made the house their home. But at night, Lisa would wake up to a strange sound, almost like whispering, faint, distant, and always coming from the floor below. Emily was the first to find it. One rainy afternoon, while playing hide-and-seek alone, she ran her fingers along the wooden panels of the kitchen wall and heard a hollow knock. Curious, she pushed against the surface, and with a soft click, a hidden door swung open. Behind it, a narrow staircase led downward into darkness. When Lisa found her daughter standing at the top of the steps, she grabbed her hand. "Where does this go?" Emily asked, eyes wide. "I don't know," Lisa admitted, her voice tight. That night, Lisa told Mark about the discovery. He laughed it off. "It's just an old basement, babe. Probably nothing down there but dust and rats." But Lisa wasn't so sure. Curiosity got the better of Lisa. When Mark and Emily were asleep, she returned to the hidden door. Armed with a flashlight, she took a deep breath and descended the stairs. The basement was vast, lined with brick walls covered in cobwebs. The air was damp, carrying the faint scent of rot. As she stepped further in, her beam landed on something that made her stomach drop. A row of rusted iron chains bolted to the wall. The chains dangled limply, but the metal was worn as if something had once struggled against them. Then she saw the scratches. Deep gouges were etched into the brick, marks of desperate fingers clawing at the walls. A wave of nausea rolled through her. Just as she turned to leave, something whispered, "Help me." Lisa froze. The voice was so soft, almost imperceptible. She swung the flashlight wildly, but nothing was there. She ran up the stairs, slammed the hidden door shut, and locked it. Lisa didn't sleep. The whisper haunted her. By morning, she convinced herself it had been her imagination. But then Emily called out from the living room, "Mom, look at this." Lisa rushed over. Emily was kneeling beside the floorboards, running her fingers over deep scratches in the wood, scratches that hadn't been there the night before. Lisa's heart pounded. They looked identical to the marks in the basement. That night, Lisa demanded Mark take a look downstairs. He rolled his eyes but agreed. When he returned, he looked pale. "You're right. It's weird." Lisa felt a strange relief. At least he believed her. But that night, the whispering returned. Only this time, it was louder. Lisa woke up gasping. It wasn't a dream. The whispering had turned into whimpering, dozens of voices desperate and pleading. And then a scream. Not loud, not piercing. A silent scream. As if someone was screaming into an abyss where no sound could escape. Lisa bolted upright and saw Emily standing in the doorway. "Mum, they're crying," she whispered. Lisa's stomach twisted. "Who?" Emily pointed at the floor. "The people under us." Lisa grabbed Emily and ran to Mark. "We need to leave now." Mark grumbled but followed them outside. The moment they stepped onto the porch, the whispering stopped. The house was silent. Too silent. Lisa did what any desperate mother would do. She researched, and what she found made her blood run cold. Langley Orphanage. The house hadn't always been a home. A century ago, it was an orphanage run by a man named Victor Langley. Dozens of children lived there, until one by one they started disappearing. Some believed Langley was selling them. Others whispered that he did something worse. One night, the town stormed the house, but it was too late. The children were gone. No bodies were ever found, but the basement, it reeked of death. Lisa stared at the old newspaper clipping, heart pounding. She had to get her family out. But the house had other plans. Lisa rushed to pack their bags, but when she reached for the front door, it wouldn't budge. The windows sealed shut. The phone dead. And then, from the hidden door, came a knock. Slow, rhythmic. Mark grabbed the crowbar. He pried the basement door open, but the stairs were gone. Only a black void remained. Then Emily screamed. Lisa turned just in time to see hands, tiny, pale hands, reaching out from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Their mouths were open in silent cries, their eyes hollow pits of despair. The house was hungry. Mark grabbed Lisa and Emily. "Run!" They ran for the attic, the only place left. As they slammed the door shut, the whispers turned into wails. The house shook. Then, silence. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a voice hollow and cold. "You can't leave. You belong to us now." Lisa held Emily close as Mark braced against the door. And then she realized the chains. The children weren't trying to hurt them. They wanted help. Lisa grabbed a shard of broken glass. With shaking hands, she carved into the wooden floor. "We hear you. We will free you." The house trembled. The voices rose in a chorus of anguish. Then, suddenly, a deafening crack. The hidden door exploded open. Light flooded the attic. The spirits, hundreds of them, rushed past, finally free. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The house went still. The door unlocked. The windows shattered. Lisa, Mark, and Emily fled, never looking back. The Langley house still stands. A new family moved in last week. They smile and wave at the neighbors. They say the house is beautiful. But at night, when the world is quiet, they hear it. A whisper. Software distant, begging to be heard. Story 5. The man in the tattered coat rain poured heavily over the small town of Greenwood, drenching the worn cobblestone streets. The dim glow of streetlights flickered, barely managing to pierce through the thick fog rolling in. Across from a small convenience store, a man stood motionless under the pale glow of a street lamp. His coat was tattered, riddled with holes and frayed edges. His head hung low, long, unkempt hair hiding most of his face. Nathan, a 24-year-old man heading home from work, noticed him from a distance. There was something unsettling about the figure. Even with the strong wind, he did not move an inch. Feeling uneasy, Nathan quickened his pace toward his apartment, a few blocks away. As he passed the man, a sharp chill ran down his spine. A strange scent lingered in the air, a mix of wet earth and something rotten, like decaying flesh. He glanced back. The man remained still, but something was different. His head had tilted slightly upward, and through the tangled hair, dark, hollow eyes stared directly at Nathan. Nathan rushed into his apartment, locking the door behind him. He tried to shake off the eerie feeling, convincing himself it was just a vagrant. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. He turned on the TV, trying to fill the silence, and tossed his jacket on the couch. But as he stepped toward the kitchen, he froze. There were wet footprints on the floor. His breath hitched. He had wiped his feet at the entrance. This shouldn't be possible. The footprints trailed from the front door, leading into the living room. Slowly, cautiously, Nathan followed them. The trail stopped at the window. He hesitated before stepping closer. Outside, the rain continued to fall, the streets empty. He let out a breath, about to close the curtains, when a flash of lightning illuminated the street. And there, directly across from his apartment, the man in the tattered coat stood. Closer this time. Nathan slept uneasily that night. In his dreams, he heard whispers. A raspy voice, barely above a breath, echoed in his mind. "Give it back. Give it back to me." Nathan jolted awake, his heart pounding. He looked at the clock. 3:07 a.m. The room was silent, but the unease remained. He lay back down, but the voice persisted. "Return it, or you will regret it." His hands clutched his head, trying to block out the sound. Then something worse happened. He heard slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the corner of his room. With a pounding heart, Nathan turned his head. A shadow stood in the darkness, a long, ragged coat dripped with rainwater. The figure's head hung low, but as it stepped forward, its face was revealed. Grey, lifeless skin stretched over hollow bones, empty eyes staring straight at him. Nathan tried to scream, but darkness swallowed him whole. Morning came, and Nathan awoke drenched in sweat. It felt like a nightmare, but the damp footprints on his floor proved otherwise. At work, he confided in his co-worker, George, about the strange events. George's face paled. "You said he was wearing a tattered coat." Nathan nodded. "There's an old story in this town," George said, his voice uneasy. "Years ago, there was a man named Elias Crowley. He was a gravedigger, lived alone. People avoided him, said he was strange, always muttering to himself. One night, his house burned down, and he vanished. No one ever found his body." Nathan's stomach twisted. "After that, people started seeing a man in a ragged coat wandering the streets at night," George continued. "They say he's looking for something he lost in the fire." Nathan's blood ran cold as he recalled the whispering voice in his dreams. "Give it back to me." That night, Nathan made a reckless decision. He needed answers. With a flashlight and a shovel, he ventured to the ruins of Elias Crowley's house. The remains of the house were long gone, but the scorched earth remained, untouched for decades. As he scanned the ground, something caught his eye. A patch of dirt that seemed fresher than the rest. Taking a deep breath, he began to dig. The cold wind howled around him as the shovel struck something solid. A rusted metal box. Hands shaking, he pried it open. Inside, lying among ashes and dust, was an old tarnished locket. And then, footsteps. Nathan turned. The man in the tattered coat stood behind him. This time, his face was clearer. Pale, cracked skin, hollow eyes that bore into Nathan's soul. The voice came again, this time aloud. "Give it back." With trembling hands, Nathan held up the locket. "Is this yours?" The figure did not move. Slowly, its skeletal hand reached out, grasping the locket. As soon as it touched his palm, the figure began to fade, turning to mist, dissolving into the night wind. And as it disappeared, one final whisper lingered in the air. "Thank you." After that night, Nathan never saw the man in the tattered coat again. His nightmares ceased. The footprints never reappeared, but sometimes, on stormy nights, when the wind howled through the empty streets, he felt something. Not fear, but a presence, a silent acknowledgement, a spirit finally at peace. The end. Story 6. The room that wasn't there yesterday. When Ethan and Clara moved into their new house on Maple Street, they were eager for a fresh start. The 2-story Victorian home had stood abandoned for years, its once beautiful facade now cloaked in ivy and dust. But despite the disrepair, something about it called to them. It was cheap too, suspiciously cheap. "You sure about this?" Clara had asked, running her fingers over the peeling wallpaper in the hallway. Ethan chuckled. "A little work, and it'll be perfect. Besides, where else can we find a house this size for this price?" Their first few days in the house were uneventful. They spent their time unpacking, fixing small things, and getting used to the creaks and groans of an old home settling into itself. The previous owners had left behind old furniture and knickknacks, giving the house an eerie, lived-in feel. Then, on the 4th day, Ethan noticed something odd. At the end of the upstairs hallway, where there had been a blank wall the day before, there was now a door. "Ethan?" Clara called from the bedroom. "Yeah? Did you put up a new door?" Ethan stepped out of their room and stared at the door in question. It was wooden, dark, and old. Too old to be something newly installed. The handle was brass, tarnished with age, and when he touched it, it felt cold. "No," he said slowly. "This wasn't here before." Clara frowned. Maybe we just didn't notice they had spent hours cleaning this hallway. There was no way they could have missed the whole door. A creeping unease settled in Ethan's gut. He twisted the knob. It turned easily. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. A single round window let in pale morning light, casting long shadows over an antique wooden desk, a rocking chair, and a bookshelf lined with faded, dust-covered tomes. The air smelled musty, as if it hadn't been disturbed in decades. "How is this possible?" Clara whispered. Ethan stepped inside. His footfalls echoed strangely, as if the space were larger than it appeared. He ran his hand over the desk. Thick dust. No signs of recent disturbance. "Should we be in here?" Clara asked, glancing over her shoulder toward the hallway. Ethan didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the bookshelf. One of the books stood out, its spine oddly pristine among the others. He reached for it and pulled it free. A low creak echoed through the room, followed by a gust of cold air, and then the whispering began. The voices were faint at first, like wind slipping through cracks, but as Ethan and Clara strained to listen, they became clearer. "Been waiting. Not supposed to be here. Run." Clara grabbed Ethan's arm. "Put it back," she hissed. Ethan shoved the book back into place, but the whispering continued. Then, something else happened, something far worse. The rocking chair began to move. It creaked back and forth, as if someone unseen had taken a seat. A shadow pooled beneath it, deep and black, writhing like liquid darkness. A breathy sigh filled the room. Clara yanked Ethan's hand. "We need to go. Now." They stumbled out, slamming the door behind them. The moment it clicked shut, the whispering stopped. They stood in the hallway, panting. "We're leaving," Clara said. Ethan nodded. but before they could move, a loud thud came from behind the door, then another, and another. Something was on the other side. That night, neither of them slept. They sat in the living room, eyes darting toward the staircase every few minutes, half expecting the door to swing open on its own. But nothing happened. By morning, Ethan gathered his courage and went upstairs. The door was gone. In its place was a blank wall, just as it had been before. Clara gasped when she saw it. It was real, right? We're not losing our minds. Ethan touched the wall, solid and cold. There was no seam, no outline where the door had been. If they hadn't seen it with their own eyes, they would have sworn it had never been there. I don't know what's happening, he admitted, voice shaking, but we need to find out what's wrong with this house. At the local library, they found old records of the house. It had been built in 1897 by a man named Victor Halloway, a reclusive scholar. Strange rumors surrounded him, whispers of occult practices, disappearances, and the belief that he had found a way to trap souls. Then, in 1923, the house was abandoned. The only known record of Victor's fate was a single newspaper clipping. Victor Halloway, presumed dead. His final words, "The room must never be opened." Ethan and Clara exchanged uneasy glances. "We opened it," Clara murmured. That night, Ethan woke to a sound. Creak. The unmistakable sound of a door opening. His stomach clenched as he turned his head toward the hallway. The door was back, and this time it was wide open. A dark figure stood in the doorway, too tall, too thin, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. It stepped forward, its feet not quite touching the ground. Ethan tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. Then the whispering began again. Clara jolted awake beside him, gasping. The figure took another step, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The door slammed shut, and then it was gone, like it had never been there. By morning, they had made their decision. They packed only what they could carry and left without looking back. The house sat silent, watching. As they drove away, Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, he swore he saw the door standing there in the open field, alone and waiting for someone else to find it. Years later, another couple moved in. On their fourth night, they noticed something strange. At the end of the hallway, where there had been only a blank wall before, there was now a door, and when they opened it, the whispering began once more. Story 7. The smell of rotten flowers. Clara had never been close to her grandmother, Madame Eliza, a woman rumoured to have strange abilities. But when the old woman passed away, Clara was the only heir listed in the will. She was summoned to an isolated estate on the outskirts of town, where Madame Eliza had spent the last decades of her life. The house was massive, Victorian in style, with tall windows and intricate carvings on its walls. It sat in the middle of a large garden filled with dead, withered flowers. A thick scent of decay hung in the air, like old earth and rotting petals. Clara wrinkled her nose as she stepped through the front door. The air inside was stale, as if the house had been holding its breath. An old maid Ruth greeted her with cold eyes and guided her to the study, where the lawyer read Madame Eliza's will. "You have inherited the house," the lawyer stated, "but there is one condition. You must live here for at least 1 month before the property is legally yours." Clara hesitated. She had no interest in the old mansion, but the house itself was worth a fortune. A month wouldn't be too bad. "I accept," she said. That night, as she settled into her grandmother's bedroom, She noticed a bouquet of roses on the nightstand. They were deep red, almost black. When she leaned in to smell them, she gagged. They reeked of something foul, like rotting flesh. She turned to Ruth. "Why do these flowers smell so bad?" Ruth's face darkened. Madame Eliza always kept fresh flowers in this room, but they never stayed fresh for long. No matter what we do, they rot faster than they should. A chill ran down Clara's spine. She moved the bouquet outside the room and shut the door. That was the first night the nightmares began. Clara dreamed of walking through the dead garden. The flowers, though wilted, moved as if whispering to her. A voice slithered through the air. "Help us." She woke with a gasp, her throat dry, her body covered in sweat. The scent of rot was even stronger now. She checked the nightstand. Another bouquet of black roses sat there, fresh yet reeking of decay. "I threw these out," she whispered, her pulse racing. She stormed downstairs, finding Ruth preparing breakfast. "Did you put those flowers in my room?" Ruth looked startled. "No, miss, I wouldn't dare." Clara didn't believe her, but she had bigger concerns. That day she explored the garden, hoping to clear her head. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something sickly sweet. She ran her fingers over the petals of a wilted rose. The moment she touched it, a whisper echoed in her mind. "Leave while you can." She yanked her hand back, heart pounding. Then she saw it. In the middle of the garden stood a single fresh rose, blood red, untouched by decay. She reached out hesitantly, but before she could pluck it, the ground beneath it shuddered, and a skeletal hand shot out from the soil. Clara screamed and stumbled backward, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The hand was gone. The rose remained. Terrified, Clara rushed inside and confronted Ruth. "There's something wrong with this house," she said. "And that garden, it's haunted." Ruth hesitated, then sighed. "You deserve to know the truth." She led Clara to the basement, a dark and musty place filled with old trunks and furniture covered in sheets. In the center of the room was a locked wooden chest. Ruth knelt, unlocking it with an old key from her apron. Inside were dried blackened flowers, hundreds of them. Among the flowers lay bones, small, delicate bones. Clara's stomach twisted. "What is this?" Ruth's voice was hollow. "Your grandmother was a gifted woman, but she did terrible things. She believed that beauty came from sacrifice. She would bury small animals, and sometimes worse, beneath her roses, believing their spirits would nourish the flowers. But the spirits, they never rested." Clara staggered back. The nightmares, the whispers, the rotting flowers, it all made sense now. Then they heard it, a scratching sound from above, and a whisper. "Clara." She turned pale. That was my grandmother's voice. Clara ran upstairs, following the voice. It led her to Madame Elisa's bedroom. The smell of decay was overwhelming now. On the bed, a bouquet of roses lay in the shape of a body, and from the center, something moved. A bony hand emerged. Clara screamed as the figure of Madame Eliza began to rise, her skin blackened and peeling, her eyes hollow pits of darkness. "You should have left, child," the corpse rasped. "But now, you are part of the garden." The windows shattered, the walls cracked, the dead flowers outside pulsed with unnatural life. Clara felt her body growing weak, her skin turning pale. She collapsed to the floor. "Bury her," Eliza whispered. The vines slithered toward Clara, wrapping around her limbs, pulling her toward the window. "No," she gasped, struggling against the unseen force. Then, Ruth stepped forward. "I'm sorry, madame," she said softly. She pulled a silver dagger from her dress and drove it into the corpse's chest. A deafening wail filled the air. The walls trembled. The vines recoiled. Eliza's body convulsed, then crumbled into dust. The house shuddered one last time before falling silent. The roses, finally, stopped rotting. Days later, Clara prepared to leave the estate. The house was still eerie, but the smell of decay was gone. She walked through the garden one last time, stopping by the single red rose that had remained untouched. She bent down, plucked it, and inhaled its scent. This time, it smelled sweet. Ruth appeared beside her. "The curse is broken," she said. Clara nodded, but a strange feeling lingered in her chest. As she walked away, she didn't notice the patch of soil behind her shift ever so slightly. And beneath the earth, something whispered, "Not yet." The end. Story 8. The thing that crawls on the ceiling. Martin had never been afraid of the dark. He had spent years working late shifts at the university library, surrounded by rows of old books and the whisper of unseen insects. When he finally moved into his new apartment, a small but comfortable unit on the 4th floor of an aging building, he was simply grateful for the quiet. The landlord, a gaunt man with deep-set eyes, had given him a heavy iron key and a brief warning. The previous tenant left in a hurry. "You might hear things at night. Just ignore them." Martin had chuckled. Old buildings made noises. Wood creaked, pipes groaned. There was nothing to worry about. For the first few nights, everything was fine. He spent his evenings reading in the dim light of his desk lamp, the quiet hum of the city outside his window. The ceiling fan spun lazily overhead. The apartment was old, sure, but nothing unusual. Then, one night, something changed. It started as a faint tapping. Martin had been lying in bed, half asleep, when he heard it, soft but deliberate, like fingernails against wood. Tap, tap, tap. He turned over, frowning. It was coming from above. "Just the old pipes," he muttered to himself. But the sound didn't stop. It grew more insistent. The taps became scratches. Long, slow scrapes, as if something sharp was being dragged across the ceiling. Martin sat up. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, and for a moment, he thought he saw something. A shadow moving just out of sight. Then silence. He let out a shaky breath. His heartbeat slowed. Maybe he had imagined it. The mind played tricks in the dark. The next morning, he checked the ceiling. The paint was cracked in places, but there were no marks, no signs of anything unusual. He shook his head and went about his day. A week passed, and the noises became more frequent. The tapping returned each night at exactly 2:33 a.m. At first, it stayed above his bed, but then it began moving, shifting across the ceiling, following him when he got up for water, pausing when he paused. Then, one night, he saw it. Martin had woken up, his mouth dry. He reached for his water bottle on the nightstand, but something made him stop. The room was colder than usual, and the air felt thick, heavy. Slowly, he looked up, and there, on the ceiling, was a shape. At first, it was just a darker patch against the shadows. But as his eyes adjusted, the details sharpened. A body, twisted, unnatural limbs pressed against the ceiling. Long fingers with claw-like nails dug into the plaster. The thing's head was turned at an impossible angle. Martin barricaded his bedroom door. He kept every light on. But at 2:33 a.m., the temperature dropped. Tap, tap, tap. The thing was back. Martin gripped his phone, his breath shallow. The tapping turned into scratching. Then, movement, slow, deliberate crawling, then knocking. His heart stopped. The sound was coming from inside the closet. He forced himself to look. The closet door was slightly open, dark, silent. Then, A whisper. "Come closer." Martin ran. He fled the apartment, stumbling down the stairs in his bare feet. He didn't stop until he was outside, gasping in the cold night air. The next day, Martin confronted the landlord. "You knew," he said. "You knew something was wrong with that apartment." The old man sighed. "You're not the first." Martin's stomach twisted. "The last tenant. What happened to him?" The landlord hesitated. "He left, just like you're going to." Martin stared. "And before him?" The landlord didn't answer, but Martin already knew. Martin moved out that day. He left most of his belongings behind. He didn't care. He found another apartment across town, newer, brighter. But even now, he doesn't sleep well. Sometimes he wakes up at exactly 2:33 a.m. and in the silence, he hears it. Tap, tap, tap. He tells himself it's just the wind, just old pipes, just his imagination. But sometimes, when he looks at the ceiling, he swears he sees something, crawling, waiting, watching. Story 9. The Whispering Dollhouse. Lena Whitmore had never been to her great-aunt Margaret's house until the day she inherited it. The imposing Victorian mansion stood on the outskirts of Blackwood, a small town shrouded in mist and local superstitions. Rumours swirled about the house, whispers of strange sounds in the night, of dolls that moved when no one was looking. But Lena, a pragmatic woman in her late 20s, dismissed them as the fabrications of bored minds. She arrived just as the autumn sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the front porch. Pushing open the heavy oak doors, she stepped inside and inhaled the scent of aged wood and dust. The house was a relic of another era. Ornate furniture, chandeliers dulled by time, and walls lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow her every move. The lawyer had left a key and a note on the hallway table. "The house is yours, but beware the dollhouse in the attic. Do not listen to its whispers." Lena frowned. A joke? A warning? Either way, she was too exhausted to care. That night, she fell asleep in one of the grand old bedrooms, unaware of the eyes that watched her from the darkness. The next morning, Lena explored the house. She ran her fingers over the dust-laden books, admired the antique clocks, and marveled at the intricate woodwork. Then she found the attic door. It creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a dim, cluttered space filled with forgotten relics. At the center of the room stood an elaborate dollhouse, an exact replica of the mansion. Every detail was eerily precise, down to the smallest pieces of furniture. Curious, Lena peered inside. Tiny porcelain dolls stood in the miniature rooms, dressed in old-fashioned clothing. They were arranged in lifelike poses, a woman standing at the top of the stairs, a child sitting in a rocking chair, a man staring out of a window. But something about them unsettled her. Their faces, though finely crafted, seemed almost sentient. As she reached out to touch one, a whisper brushed against her ear. "Help us." Lena froze, heart hammering. She spun around, but the attic was empty. The whisper had come from the dollhouse. That night, strange things began to happen. Lena woke to the sound of soft footsteps echoing through the halls. At first, she assumed it was the old house settling, until she saw the rocking chair in the corner of her room moving on its own. She stared, paralyzed, as the chair creaked back and forth, an invisible force pushing it. The next morning, she returned to the attic. The dolls had changed positions. The woman now stood at the foot of the staircase. The child was peering out of a window, and the man was no longer inside. A chill ran down Lena's spine. Had she moved them? No, she hadn't touched them. Then the whispers started again. Please, free us. Lena stumbled back. The voices were soft, pleading, but undeniably real. Against her better judgment, she leaned closer. Trapped, so long. She watches. Lena's breath hitched. Who? The dollhouse trembled. The attic door slammed shut behind her. And then, for the first time, she saw it. A shadow in the corner of the attic, watching her with hollow eyes. Frantic, Lena dug through the house's old records, desperate to understand what was happening. She found Margaret's journals buried in a locked chest. The entries were disturbing. They disobeyed me, so I made them mine forever. The dollhouse keeps them safe. They whisper sometimes, but they'll learn to be silent. A new girl will come. Maybe she will listen. Maybe she will join them. Lena's stomach churned. Margaret had trapped souls in that dollhouse. The dolls weren't just objects. They were people. That night, she heard a new whisper. This time, it wasn't pleading. It was laughing. Margaret's voice. Stay, dear Lena. You'll make a lovely doll. Lena had to end it. She returned to the attic, armed with a hammer and lighter fluid. The dolls stood differently now, crowded at the windows, as if watching her. The whispers grew frantic. Destroy it before she stops you. With trembling hands, Lena doused the dollhouse in fuel. A shadow loomed behind her. Margaret's twisted apparition, her face contorted in rage. Lena struck a match. The fire roared to life. Margaret screamed, an inhuman wail that shattered the attic windows. The dolls trembled, their porcelain faces cracking. And then, silence. The shadow was gone. The whispers had ceased. The dolls, now lifeless, collapsed into ash. As dawn broke, Lena stumbled out of the house, never looking back. Months later, the mansion was sold and abandoned. The townspeople whispered about its final resident, the woman who had set fire to something unseen. But deep in the ruins, beneath the ashes of the dollhouse, a single porcelain doll remained intact. And if one listened closely, one could still hear a whisper. Help me. Story 10. The night the stars went out. The town of Black Hollow had always been shrouded in an eerie quiet. It wasn't deserted. People lived there, went to work, raised families. But something about the town felt off, as if it existed just slightly out of sync with the rest of the world. Then came the night the stars went out. It started like any other evening. The autumn wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The town's streetlights flickered with a dull, sickly yellow glow, casting long, uncertain shadows across the cracked sidewalks. Martha Reynolds, a retired schoolteacher, sat in her rocking chair on her porch, sipping lukewarm tea as she gazed up at the night sky. She had always loved stargazing. Ever since she was a child, she found comfort in the constellations, in their silent promise of constancy. But tonight, as she tilted her head back, she frowned. There were no stars, not a single one. She blinked, rubbed her eyes and looked again. The sky wasn't cloudy, nor was it the deep, infinite black she was used to. Instead, it was an abyss, a perfect, empty void, darker than any darkness she had ever seen. A feeling of wrongness crawled up her spine, and a strange pressure built in her chest. It wasn't just the absence of stars. It was something more, something primal, something watching. Across town, others began to notice it too. James Carter, the local bartender, stepped outside for a cigarette and felt an unsettling tightness in the air, as if the very fabric of the night had shifted. He looked up and cursed under his breath. Meanwhile, a group of teenagers hanging out by the old quarry felt the silence first. The usual symphony of crickets and distant barking dogs had ceased entirely. Then they looked up and saw the same void. One of them, a boy named Travis, pulled out his phone to check the time, but his screen only showed static before flickering off completely. Something was very, very wrong. By midnight, the entire town was in a state of uneasy confusion. Phones had stopped working, the internet was down, and the power flickered unpredictably. People gathered in small groups, whispering anxiously, casting nervous glances at the impossibly empty sky. Then the knocking began. It started on the outskirts of town, where the old farmer, Henry Winslow, lived alone in his crumbling farmhouse. A slow, deliberate knock on his door. Not the hurried knocking of a lost traveller, nor the friendly rap of a neighbour. This was something else, something patient. Henry, who had lived through enough hard winters to know when to trust his instincts, didn't open the door. Instead, he peered through the curtain. There was nothing there. Yet the knocking continued. Closer to town, at the gas station, a young woman named Claire was finishing up her late shift when she heard the sound. A rhythmic, measured knock on the glass window. She turned, expecting to see a customer, perhaps someone seeking help after losing phone service. But there was no one. Just the reflection of the empty street lights in the window. The sound came again, louder this time, and this time the glass vibrated slightly, as if something heavy had pressed against it. She grabbed her phone, but it was useless. Heart pounding, she backed away from the window. Then the power cut out completely. The town's residents soon realized that the knocking was spreading. It came to every home, every building, sometimes slow and deliberate, sometimes frantic and insistent. But whenever someone opened the door, nothing was there. A few brave souls tried venturing into the darkness, carrying flashlights and weapons, but none returned. By dawn, if it could still be called that, Black Hollow was in chaos. The sky remained an abyss. The sun never rose. It wasn't merely night. It was something beyond night. Time itself seemed to warp. People began seeing things in the dark. Shapes moving at the edges of their vision, figures just barely out of reach. Some claimed they heard whispers, faint, unintelligible voices slithering through the silence. Others spoke of something worse. Reflections in mirrors that didn't match their movements, shadows that lingered too long after they should have faded. And then the disappearances began. Martha Reynolds was one of the first to go. One moment she was speaking to her neighbor on the porch, trying to remain calm, and the next she was gone. No scream, no struggle, just gone. James Carter locked himself in his bar, barricading the doors with heavy furniture. But at some point in the night, the knocking on the walls became unbearable. And then it was inside. The next morning, if it was still morning, his bar was empty, the doors still locked, the furniture undisturbed, but he was gone. One by one, the town's residents vanished, until only a handful remained. Travis, Claire, and an older man named Richard were among the last survivors. They gathered in the church, the only place where the knocking had not yet come. Richard, a former priest who had long abandoned his faith, sat with his back against the altar, clutching an old rosary with shaking hands. "What do they want?" Claire whispered. Richard exhaled shakily. "I don't think they want anything. I think they just are." Travis, his voice barely steady, asked, "Then why take people?" Richard shook his head. "Maybe they're not taking us. Maybe we're simply ceasing to exist." The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then the church doors rattled. A slow, deliberate knock. They froze. The doors creaked open, though none of them had moved to unlock them. The void stretched beyond the doorway, deeper than the dark of the church, and within it, the shapes began to emerge. Tall, impossibly thin figures with elongated limbs and featureless faces. Their bodies seemed to flicker, as though they were not entirely part of this world. Claire let out a shuddering breath. We can't stay here." Richard clenched his rosary tighter, murmuring prayers that no longer held meaning. Travis took a slow step back. "Then where do we go?" No one had an answer, because beyond the church doors, there was no town left. The buildings had faded into the void. The streets were gone. There was only darkness and the figures that waited within it. And then the knocking stopped, and the last of Black Hollow was swallowed whole. Days, weeks, years, none of it mattered anymore. There was no time where they had gone. No stars, no light, no escape. Only the endless night